So I want to start with a quote that is, remember, time is money. And I think this is something that is really often overlooked in cybersecurity, right? We always think of our adversaries as people who are purely doing this for fun and just want to cause havoc. But I think the reality is, in a lot of cases, our adversaries are actually very financially incentivized. And if we could take this philosophy or mantra almost into all aspects of security, I think we can really change the way that we protect ourselves today. Before we jump into the, problem of bots, I want to start with a relatively simple question, and that's, what is a bot? And I think this is something that is really often overlooked. When we think of bots, we typically think of these automated browsers that are impersonating users, clicking ads to perform fraud or whatever it may be. But the reality is they're actually a lot simpler in many cases. And I'm sure some of you in the audience today have used many bots, be that something as simple as a vulnerability scanning tool like SQL Map or your Burp Suite or Burp Intruder, right up to the more sophisticated end, right? What Selenium, Puppeteer controlling Chromium or whatever it may be for automated UI testing. Now, this whole spectrum, they're bots, right? They're robots that are performing actions on behalf of a user, thousands of times the speed. And the reality is that our adversaries are more often than not using these exact same tools against us. So while we're using a vulnerability scanning tool to economically test our external infrastructure as to whether or not it's safe, our adversaries are probably using the exact same one to test where they can get in. Now, bots really are very bad, because of three main reasons. Now, the first one is it's an incredibly low barrier to entry. Right, if you think about how easy it is to go onto something like Google and download one of thousands of free tools like SQL Map or something more sophisticated, and then go straight over to YouTube and look at the thousands of free tutorials on how to configure those tools and then launch attacks, means even a relatively novice attacker can actually launch quite a sophisticated automated attack, which is quite a frightening concept. Now, automation also enables our adversaries to be incredibly economical, right? In the same way that we as businesses are using automation to make our lives easier and our organizations more efficient, our adversaries are actually doing the exact same thing. Automation enables them to launch attacks which previously were not economically viable. So an example of that may be account takeover or credential stuffing. Before the foray into the sophisticated bots that perform these actions, it wasn't economically viable for someone to sit there and test credentials, given that only maybe a fraction of a % of these stolen credentials will work. But when a bot can perform thousands and thousands of automated logins, at the click of a button and I can go and eat my sandwich while it does it, all of a sudden it's something that's incredibly economically viable. And finally, bots tend to evade traditional defenses. They're incredibly good at mimicking human behavior and with relatively small tweaks to config, things like user agent rotation or IP address rotation is something that can be built right in, which can circumvent almost every traditional WAF. Now, from the defender's perspective, there's actually also a big problem with bots as well. Right? It's very uneconomical for us to protect ourselves, and that starts with human time. You think about any time someone launches a highly distributed bot attack against the system. All of a sudden, we've got to sift through thousands and thousands of alerts to figure out which ones actually mean something to give us a starting point of where to look to go further. And then we've got to play the fun game of whack-a-mole. Block their IP address, have them come from a new one, block the next one. Right? It's just not sustainable. Then we move over to user agents. Again, the exact same game. Your attackers are constantly on the front foot and us on the back foot, purely from a time perspective that it takes to mitigate these attacks. Secondly, there's actually quite a large cost to sustain these attacks. In a world where we pay for what we use, sustaining the infrastructure or the bandwidth to a high volume automated attack can actually cost a lot of money, particularly where this is ongoing and maybe something like content scraping, which is actually taking large volumes of data from a website and sucking it down. Also in the case where we use services that are pay per transaction. So think of a payment gateway where I pay maybe 10 or 20 cents per transaction that flows through, or even an authentication platform where I have to pay per validation of an account. If we multiply that by millions and millions in these high volume attacks, it's actually quite an expensive attack purely just to let occur. And then finally, revenue loss. Right, if we think of the cases where the application either has to be taken offline because of a customer account's getting compromised, or it gets sent offline just from the sheer volume of requests flowing in, there's huge revenue loss there. Again, also where our accounts contain monetary values, be that hard dollars, gift cards, reward points, right? When attackers get into accounts and siphon them out, that's an incredible revenue loss, because at the end of the day, our customers have to be reimbursed. So we're going to do a few demos during this talk with a few different scenarios, but to set the scene, we're going to look at a fraud group which has obtained 1 million stolen credit cards. They've phished them, they've bought them online. The point is they now have to figure out firstly which ones are valid, so that they can secondly sell those valid ones, but also use them to fraudulently purchase gift cards and sell those gift cards at a profit on the dark web. Now they're going to be targeting a anonymous retail corporation in this demo, who we will call Acme. Let me whip this up. So Acme are a very large retailer that have both brick and mortar stores, and if we get this to work, perfect, brick and mortar stores, and then an online retail store. Now these gift cards can be used to purchase physical goods at the click of a button and then have them sent off to wherever it may be. So what these attackers are going to do in this scenario, let me refresh, is validate these credit cards. If the credit card is valid, subsequently purchase a gift card and sell it. So this $50 gift card to Acme means a $50 loss of revenue, because eventually it actually has to be reimbursed. And subsequently, for every failed transaction, it costs them 20 cents from their payment provider. So this is actually based off a real attack that we've worked with, and it was very gnarly for the particular customer. So in the first scenario, if I jump back to here, we're going to be looking at a completely exposed gateway. So no WAF, no CDN, no nothing, right? There's the attacker, internet, and the gateway. And the only thing restricting the attacker is how fast they can push their bots. So if I launch this first attack, what we'll see in the event log over on the right-hand side is all of a sudden an influx of both failed transactions and successful validations. We can see that these failed transactions are batched, and in some cases they're actually costing $30, $40, $50 per batch, just purely because of the high volume. Now every successful transaction, again, costs $50 for the gift card that was purchased and then fraudulently used, and then 20 cents for the actual validation. So you can see here in more or less the first 30 seconds of the attack, this has already cost the organization $4,500, which in the attack we actually saw was on the low end. The group we worked with peaked at about $470 per second, which is mortifying. So I have 1 million credit cards to get through. So far I'm already through 9,000 or so. This attack is going to take me the better part of 20 minutes maybe, off a single 8-core MacBook Pro. That's phenomenal, incredible ROI. There's been zero resistance met from me, and really Acme's only option at this point would be to just take the system offline, which would mean no one could purchase anything from their e-commerce platform. So now looking at traditional defenses, Acme have had this attack, they've taken their platform offline, and they now have to figure out, all right, what are we going to do to protect ourselves? So the first logical decision, we'll implement a WAF. Right, we'll leverage its IP rate limiting and some of its technology that can track usage to identify this bot that's hitting us and changing IPs every time we manually block one, and then stop it in its tracks. So looking at the WAF and I guess where it is now and where it's come from, over the last 20 years, it's evolved from very simple and trivial things like SQL injection, your little classic 1 = 1, right up to your more sophisticated ones where where attackers are encoding payloads or doing all sorts of funky stuff. So it's really come a long way, but unfortunately, it's always keeping us on the back foot, and that's for a few reasons. Firstly, they're very complex to set up. to get one in production working effectively generally requires very skilled professionals, right? The barrier to entry is incredibly high. We have to make sure that the rules aren't too strict where they're blocking legitimate customers, because no business wants that. But at the same time, we need to manage it with the risk of letting too much malicious traffic through, which again is a fine line that every organization will have a slightly different stance on. Secondly, they're incredibly static. Right? At the end of the day, most WAFs are a regex machine, right? They're looking at a request that comes in, doing some basic pattern matching, using some heuristics in the more sophisticated cases to spit out a score, and then decide whether or not something should be blocked or not. Now, unfortunately, this means that as attackers evolve, we are forced to catch up. Right? We can only ever block known knowns, which is, I guess, the final problem of the WAF. Right? It's very difficult for us to block something from a regex that hasn't been written. Right? Well, it's almost impossible. So all of this means we're very much on the back foot, and one of the, I guess, big problems with the fundamental design of a WAF, it goes by the rule of innocent until proven guilty, which means that we have no way of getting just ahead of the attacker. So now looking at the WAF in this Acme demo. So the attackers had to slightly modify how they're doing things. Instead of just having one machine that's spitting directly at the payment gateway, now what we're going to do is leverage a residential proxy network. Now, there are many of these today, and more often than not, we're actually part of them. When we download plugins or like Holler VPN or use certain apps on our phone that don't have ads but are free, more often than not, we actually become exit nodes for these proxies, which is very concerning. So what we're going to do now is run this same attack against the payment gateway with the WAF in front of it. So what you can see now on the right-hand side is every time my bot's detecting that an IP has been blocked, it's actually rotating the user or the IP address through another proxy and then testing again until that one gets blocked. So you can see immediately there's a clear difference in terms of how many requests I'm able to actually get through. Right? Adding another proxy layer to my attack network, it drastically increases latency, and it also increases complexity because I've got to take a lot of asynchronous problems into account. But at the end of the day, you can see that I can still get a number of successful transactions through in a relatively short period of time. So again, 1 million credit cards to verify. While this attack now won't take 20 minutes, it'll probably take the better part of a few hours, maybe a day, absolute worst case. But it's good. Acme's on the right step. However, when the attacker comes back and decides to start launching more high volume attacks and actually start adding to their bots on the back end, right, this IP rate limit is going to hit its limit of usefulness. So now we've got to think about, all right, how do we really help protect Acme? They've hit their wit's end, right? They need to combat, I guess, the more sophisticated attackers like they're seeing now, as well as the more simple ones, right? The guys who are running vulnerability scans or doing whatever they do. Now, this is really what Casada's built on, and when we were designing the solution, we really wanted to tackle a few fundamental flaws with how we've previously built everything today. So the first one is challenging the idea of trusting something until it's proven guilty, right? That's a relatively, I guess, difficult thing to work with in security when we need to very quickly identify and block. So we built something that went on the model of assuming everything's guilty until it's proven innocent. And secondly, we needed to actually go about targeting what is allowing these attacks to be economical, and that's the automation. Right? We really need to think about what we can disarm from the attacker's perspective to challenge the viability of their attacks. So we need to make sure that we stop automation, because that's really the only thing that enables them to be successful. We also needed to change it from the defender's perspective, right? We need to challenge that uneconomical nature of traditional defenses, because otherwise, we're not really addressing the whole problem set. So the first thing with this is it needed to be very simple to set up. Right? To be successful, we needed to build a defense that really anyone in an organization's web infrastructure team or security team could pick up, learn how to use and deploy almost on their own, at a moment's notice. Right? We couldn't have something that required a week or two of learning mode and then go into blocking mode and then pull it back out because engineering decided to release a new update to the application. Right? We need something that can be very, very quick and effective to deploy. So during an attack like what Acme have been receiving, they can be protected almost immediately. Now the next thing is we need it to be very dynamic. Right? It needs to be a platform that can respond as the attackers both retool, but then also change how they actually go about attacking. And this is very critical. When we're looking at the WAF, typically it's not a very dynamic model. Right? It relies on that highly static rule set. And that leads me into the final point. We can't rely on rules. Right? Rules will always keep us on the back foot. When we have to wait for an attacker to build some new payload or whatever it may be, and then subsequently create a rule set for it, by then the attackers use the bot to spray the internet and see who's vulnerable to that new exploit. Right. So in order to change the economic equation from the attacker's perspective, we need to increase the barrier to entry. Now, we designed a solution that does this in two ways. Firstly, the skill barrier. Right, by stopping automation out of the box, we actually disarm more or less every single tool that's out there. Right, we actually force the attacker's skill set to be far more sophisticated, even just to get off the ground. Right, you can no longer go to one of these many websites and download one of these free applications and then use the YouTube tutorial to launch the attack. Right, it just won't work. So now the script kiddies and the sort of lower end guys, they're all eliminated, and we now can focus on the more sophisticated ones who are financially motivated. And then that's the second point with the barrier to entry. We need to increase the time it takes to actually launch these attacks from actual writing my new custom bot, but then also the time it takes for my computer to actually run through and guess all of these iterations. So increasing the cost can be done in a few ways. Firstly, by increasing time, and then secondly, by actually increasing the compute cost to these attacks. And that's what really influenced us when we were designing this solution. So back to our demo. Acme have now been using the WAF, and what they've actually decided to do is put us behind the WAF so we can do that first layer of filtering, and then so that we can come in to do that next layer of assurance or validation against the application. Now in this particular demo, we've removed part of the functionality of what we're doing, and we're actually just going to focus on one component, and that's what we call the cryptographic challenge. So this is the piece that targets the underlying cost to launch the attack. And at its core, it's a mathematical proof of work. So before every request that gets submitted to us that we're going to subsequently send on to this payment gateway, we're going to issue this mathematical proof of work and force this bot to solve it, which will take n seconds based on how the bot's interacted with the website. Is it using the front end? Is it just hitting the API directly? And then subsequently let the request through. And we'll have a look at the difference in terms of the time that it actually takes. All right. So I've started running my new bot, allegedly. There we go. I don't know what went wrong then. So we can see the bot's requested a challenge. Now it's actually processing and attempting to solve it before it can subsequently test the stolen credit cards that it has. And we can see it did it. Perfect. It only took 1.93 million iterations of this hash problem to solve it. And was it that 11 seconds? So, out of the gate, you can see literally in the last 30 seconds, we've managed to validate 2 of our million stolen credit cards. Right, so our attack time just went from 20 minutes to a few hours to now I think this would take probably close to 3 months to finish if my quick maths in my head is correct. The attack is no longer economically viable. In no world is an attacker going to continue to try to hit Acme, even though every so often they can get a transaction through. it's just not worth it. They're going to go straight to the other payment gateway that's not implementing something as sophisticated, and have fun from there. Oh, back to this one. So that's an example of how it actually works in something that was a very high volume, highly rewarding attack, to the new case, which is now without even the other components of what we do, just purely based on the runtime of an attack, something that's completely uneconomical. So I want to leave you with, I guess, three main thoughts. Yep. Firstly, automation's incredibly economical, right? It's phenomenally economical for us to leverage it internally. It's also phenomenally economical for our adversaries to use it against us. And in order to really, I guess, combat this risk, we need to think about how we challenge that. Secondly, we need to move away from these very static, traditional defenses in really whatever way we can. Whether we're trying to protect ourselves from someone scanning our websites to find SQL vulnerabilities or whatever it may be, right up to someone performing credential abuse or content scraping, the common denominator is automation. If we remove automation, we actually remove an enormous number of the risks that all of these threats pose. And then finally, we need to think about how we increase the cost of an attack. Right? As we started with, time is money. If we can drive up the cost of an attack to an attacker, both in time, but then also economics, it means we're in a far better place to defend ourselves, and we actually are on the front foot. Because now the attacker has to think, is this actually worth it? I'm going to have to invest quite a lot of time in this. Can I just go to the next application and hit them where it hurts? Thanks everyone for coming today. As it says, please fill out the surveys in the app. Stumbling there. And I hope you enjoy the rest of AWS Reinforce.